New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is the practice of presence. My guest is Glenn Hartelius, who is co-director of psychology programs and director of the Integral, Transpersonal, and Positive Psychology PhD concentration at the California Institute for Human Science. He is the recipient of the Abraham Maslow Award given by the Humanistic Psychology Division of the American Psychological Association. He has served as editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Transpersonal Studies and co-editor of the Wiley-Blackwell Handbook of Transpersonal Psychology. He has also served as vice president of the International Transpersonal Association. His most recent book is The Anatomy of Presence: Turn Your Inner Authenticity into Outer Impact and Success, co-authored with Michaela Azer. Glenn lives in California, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Glenn. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jeff. Thank you.
I guess a good starting point for our conversation would be the fact that you are a director of a concentration, a doctoral level concentration at the California Institute for Human Science that involves integral, transpersonal, and positive psychology. And I think probably many, maybe most of our viewers will know about transpersonal psychology, but integral psychology and positive psychology, I think among our audience are a little less well known. So maybe a good starting point would be for you to define those terms. And while we're at it, I know you received the Abraham Maslow Award for your work in humanistic psychology.
That's right. You know, all of those, what we're really going for is a whole person psychology. And transpersonal has, one of the better sort of collections of literature in that area. And positive psychology, it's a way of bridging into the psychology that we have today. Positive psychology has some important impacts at areas that they cover as well. And of course, the term positive psychology was first developed by Abraham Maslow as well, in his 1963 edition, one of his classic books, and so he was the one who defined that, and really, he was doing it against the backdrop of behaviorism and psychoanalysis, saying, we need something more constructive, more helpful to people with their lives, and of course. Then that term was picked up by Marty Seligman and Csikszentmihalyi in the 2000 launch of Positive Psychology, Integral Psychology. It's really to include another area that is really has the same kind of goal, which is psychology is great. I mean, in the United States, psychology it's bigger here than anywhere else in the world. We love psychology, and, cognitive psychology, behavioral, neuroscience, all these things are wonderful. The problem is that they only cover beliefs, behavior, and biology. And there's a lot more to us than that. And so the integral, the transpersonal, the positive are ways, are kind of inroads into building psychology that deals with more of who we are as human beings. And for that reason is able to, develop some of the things that actually help people heal and cultivate the potentials.
I've often, maybe it's mistaken, but I've often associated positive psychology with the positive thinking movement.
Yeah, no, that's different. Positive thinking is really sort of using your intention to create results in the world. Positive psychology, in the same way, it really picks up on, Maslow's notion that Freud gave us the sick half of psychology, and then the aspiration of humanistic and transpersonal psychology to deal with positive human potentials.
So if somebody were to enroll in your program at CIHS, they're really looking at, I guess, what Maslow called the further reaches of human nature.
That's right. And it's like the whole person that includes those further reaches. And the thing is, what's unique about our program is that, if you go to a state school, a good state university, Ivy League, you'll get great research chops, but you will get expertise in the area that your chair wants to study. And if you go to a holistic program, in the more humanistic, transpersonal, integral approaches, we haven't been as good at publishing research. Really good on philosophy and experience and so on and so forth. And for that reason, we haven't had nearly as much influence as we ought to have on the larger discipline of psychology. So what we have that's a little different is that we have a strong emphasis, not only on like finishing your dissertation, but it's like we need to build this. We need to have that impact. I mean, it's like there are hundreds of millions of people who would benefit from getting the evidence so that the kinds of things that we know work, because we've experienced them, can actually be more widely available and more widely accepted. So we have a focus on, really, this is for people who want to kind of join the team and say, great, if this stuff is good, let's build the evidence. Let's have an impact on the wider discipline of psychology so that that wider discipline can do a better job of helping people heal and helping people reach their potentials.
And your own focus has largely been on the singular question of human attention.
Yes. I actually, some of my background was really with healing work and kind of those subtle qualities of presence. And I realized that, I had a very early interest in what we'd now call anomalous phenomena, which for me as a kid was, miraculous healing. And I thought, wow, that is just the coolest thing. It's I was about 6 years old when I was at a kind of a house of worship, and I was standing outside of where I had just been with, the other kids my age, and I was standing next to an adult. And at that time I thought, well, when you grow up, then you know everything. So if you want to know something, you just find a grown-up and you ask them and they'll know. So there was somebody that I didn't know, some man standing next to me. And so I tapped him on the leg and I said, how old do I have to be before they teach me how to heal people? And he bent down and he said, oh, we don't do that anymore. Now we go to medical school. And I remember looking up at him and said, wow, you don't even know, do you? So I had this real desire to participate in healing. And then, over the years, I realized that really there was a shift in state of consciousness that happened when these kinds of events occurred. And so that what we needed to do was figure out, how does that happen? And, now, having gone for my PhD and, looking through the literature, we don't actually have very good descriptions of how states of consciousness are changed. I kind of prefer the term global cognitive state, because it's kind of like it's a reordering of access. What we have available shifts in terms of our different capacities. And from that, in my own journeys, and also in the work with my co-author on the book, Michaela Azer, really noticed that the thing that changed was the bodily location of the felt sense of self, where attention was coming from. When we talk about attention, practically the only thing we talk about in terms of location is, what is your attention pointed at? Where is your attention? Oh, it's pointed at the cat over there. And yet, where attention comes from, where we experience it coming from in the body, also changes, and that has a profound impact on our state. So, to me, access, coming to understand how the state shift happens, was a doorway to better understand how healing might work, how some of these anomalous events might work, and understanding self-location in terms of attention, where we feel it to be coming from in the body, was a key to understanding state shift.
If I recall correctly, you really got into this work originally as a body worker.
Yes, that's right. Which was not part of my professional plan, and yet it was exactly the thing I needed. Essentially, I got married, and it's like, oh, I need a job now. And this was something that was at hand. My parents came from Denmark, where, at the time that they were growing up, sort of this sort of self-help and self-healing work with spas and body work and healthy diet was very popular. And so, I was familiar with that. And so when there was an opportunity to learn that, I thought, well, great, I'll learn that. I can learn that quickly, and I can, I'll have a job. And I ended up sort of doing that as my main gig for about 10 years. And even though it was really, I just considered it a day job, what it did was it got me out of my head. Mm-hmm. Because I was one of those people that I was so much in my head. I didn't even, it was like, oh, there's my body. Look at that. It's growing out of me. I was so in my head that ordinary ways of meditation and whatever just wouldn't work for me. And it was actually that level of challenge, the fact that it was so difficult for me, that gave me the opportunity to watch the process, watch my learning process more carefully. I was about the hardest case I would ever encounter. And so just being present with clients and in that quiet space and working somatically gave me the opportunity to learn how to shift.
I've actually never done body work myself, but I've been the recipient of it. And I know that many times when I'm working with a specialist, particularly in deep tissue massage work, I was Rolfed by Ida Rolf, actually. They ask you to put your attention wherever they're working, so the recipient kind of helps. And so I would imagine that gave you a sense of what happens when people move their attention to different parts of their body.
Well, there's a difference there, because when you're pointing your attention at where a body worker is working, that again is just moving the target of attention. But when you're working with people in that quiet space all day, you start to shift. You start to become less in your head and more in your body. And as a matter of fact, one of the ways that I first experienced this was I noticed that people's breathing would shift. That at some point, that first they would be breathing, they would be chest breathing, their back would be rising and falling. And at some point, they would drop in, and it felt like there was something that moved from their chest down to the belly. It was just like, and then all of a sudden it's the lower back that's rising and falling. And, one of my early experiences was I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. It looks like something moves. I wonder if I could get it to move. So a client came in, went face down, and so I kind of imagined that I could take a hold, without touching the person, take a hold of something that seemed to be around their head. And then I slowly pulled it down to the chest and down to the abdomen. And immediately the breath changed. It felt like it just dropped into place, and immediately the breath changed. I thought, wow, what was that? I have never heard of anything like that. And when there's that shift, that's when there's also a change in perception. Because I had a client who came in, and as the client came in, I got this stabbing pain in my shin. And so as they were getting on the table, I was trying to think to myself, did I bump something this morning on my way out of the house? Did I strain something? What did I do? Couldn't think of anything. And then when I got to that client's shin, suddenly they jumped in pain. I thought, well, that's odd. They have pain in the place that I felt pain when they came in. That's not possible. And it happened a couple more times the same day. And I realized that I would have to consider the possibility that some information was being transmitted to my body when I was in this state. And, I just went with that assumption, and that proved really helpful in terms of being able to read what was going on with the person. And yet, like in psychology, we don't have a way to understand that.
No, it almost seems like telepathy, but I don't want to get distracted by the paranormal at the moment, which is easy for me to do. But I want to get back to the notion of the center of attention, where the attention is coming from. That I gather in the first story you told me where something moved from the upper chest down to the belly, I think is what you expressed. And I think what you're suggesting is that might have been the center of that person's attention.
Yeah, or center or seat of attention, yes.
Seat of attention.
Where the attention where we feel it arising in the body experience.
Because I think in the modern world, most people assume that the center of their attention is right behind the eyes. Typically, but as I recall, in ancient cultures, it was often thought that the center of attention was in the heart.
Well, there's a great story in one of Jung's writings about how he had a conversation with a Hopi elder, and the Hopi elder said to him something like, "You Europeans, you think with your heads, don't you?" And Jung said, "Well, of course. Don't you?" And the Hopi elder replied, "No, we think with our hearts." And I think that's a lovely story. And we have this kind of basic assumption that because the brain is in the head, then when we're sitting in the head, of course, that's the only place to be.
Obviously, your research takes you into the whole body.
Yes. And as a matter of fact, there is some research. There's actually some research on the difference, because there is a percentage of the population that self-locates in the heart. And this research shows that where one self-locates impacts personality, impacts self-construal, impacts emotional qualities, relational qualities, and the fact that we can easily change self-location means that we have a way to access different resources so that when we need, so for example, one of the studies found that students who self-located in the head had higher GPA than those who self-located in the heart. And yet those who self-locate in the heart are emotionally warmer than those who self-locate in the head. But, it's like we need both of those things, right? We need to be able to use our intellect, and we need to be able to relate emotionally. And so by being able to regulate self-location through our attentional stance, which is really the basis of the work that I do, that gives us access to our capacities, to our resources, to our potentials in a much more effective way, in a way that we have direct and simple control over.
Would I be overstating it, Glenn, if I said this is your unique scientific discovery that we can do this?
Yes. I mean, there are people doing different kinds of work that are related, but in terms of developing the language, developing the constructs, doing the research, doing the neuroscience research, and demonstrating this, that I would say that's not an overstatement.
That's incredibly exciting, I have to say.
I know, right? I mean, this to me is like, wow. It was like, I had this work that I was doing, and it was like, well, you know what? I could just go out and teach this, but I'm taking people's time. I'm taking their attention. And in order to do that, I really need to go and do a PhD, and I need to find out who else has done this work and really situate it in the literature and in kind of the ongoing, project of psychology. And I did, and I found out that this work wasn't out there. These constructs weren't out there. And, it took a fair amount, which was surprising because, usually when you go to the literature, there's a lot more than you expected to find. This wasn't there. And that was exciting. And then, a few years after graduation, I got connected with, my colleagues that I work with now, Dr. Laura Likova and Dr. Christopher Tyler, just really, great researchers and human beings. And I found, we designed a study, got a little bit of funding, we did the study. And then, it's like you have some idea and you think, well, I could research this. And you go, yeah, but am I really going to get any evidence? And you really don't have any idea. And when the results came back and we had clear results, that was really exciting. So to say, okay, this thing that I've kind of gone out on a limb, and I've spent the last 15 years of my life pursuing this and coming up to this point and kind of putting everything on the line, believing that this might be something. And you find out that you really have the evidence. That's very rewarding.
I feel the wow myself. But I want, for the benefit of our viewers, to be clear about the story here, because back when you were doing body work, massage, essentially, you discovered that you, through a process of concentration of some sort, were able to move the center of attention of your client from the upper body, the upper chest, down to the belly. But now you've talked about that people can do this themselves. They don't need another person to do it for them.
That's right. So, for example, we just finished a study. We've just submitted it to the journal Mindfulness. And we worked both with meditation novices and MBSR practitioners, John Kabat-Zinn's, really excellent system, mindfulness-based stress reduction, because we wanted to see whether what we thought, because we had predicted what a particular attention stance would be that's associated with MBSR, which of course is in the Vipassana tradition. And we were able to teach novices this process in about half an hour. And then they would do a 10-minute process, and the amount of stress reduction that they got and the amount of increase in mindfulness that they got was almost identical with people who had gone through an 8-week, course of education and years of practice. So that gave us confidence that this was actually a much clearer marker, a quicker way, which we hope will help to improve MBSR instruction so that people are able to learn it more quickly.
To be clear, the idea is that a person can learn to locate I'll call it their center of attention. There must be a different word maybe that you use, but it can be located in various areas of the body.
Yeah, the seat of attention. A lot of us, it sits in the head. I mean, that's pretty culturally normal, right? But then it can be moved to the heart, and it can be moved to the abdomen. And so by learning how to self-regulate that, it gives us access much more quickly to be able to shift. So, for example, one of the things that we found was that by bringing the seat of attention to the abdomen, so with the EEG study that we did, we found we took the signals that was associated with that, we tested 11 different attentional stances, and we did it with 128 electrodes, and we downsampled it so that we could match some data that was derived from 10 different positive emotions, so that we could compare, do the brain signals overlap between the positive emotions and these different attentional stances. And we found that when the seat of attention was in the abdomen, it cross-correlated strongly with 3 positive emotions, 2 of which are something called low arousal positive affect and high arousal positive affect. High arousal positive affect is things like joy, excitement, surprise. It's like your nervous system is up, you are on, you are just kind of excited, right? And your neurons are firing actively, and you feel good. And that is different from low arousal positive affect. That's things like gratitude, contentment, serenity. And the low arousal positive affect is actually what is associated with life satisfaction. So we found that when the seat of attention was in the abdomen, the abdominal attentional stance, that it generated 2 of the 3 emotions that it correlated with. And there was only 3 out of 11 that even correlated with positive emotions. So this was an important stance. 2 out of the 3 were low arousal positive affect emotions. So it's like that was more evidence that this was associated with mindfulness, that this was kind of a stance that gave you that sense of comfortableness, that lowered reactivity to what's going on in your life. And so a really beneficial stance.
And I understand that you work with clients as well and have seen some remarkable things happen with your clients who are able to easily learn the techniques involved in moving the seat of attention to different locations in the body.
Yes. And, most of my work has been done with business leaders, and really people who need to have rapid access to their highest functions. And typically they will know that they have these capacities, but they won't always know how they get there. So by showing them exactly step by step, okay, You're going to hold a meeting. Okay, you got to hold a room of 300 people. Oh, you have to establish rapport with this person. Here's exactly how you do it, step by step, so that the audience is with you, they can feel you, and you have impact. And so that's, and I also teach psychotherapy students in terms of how do you create that sense of safe space, that sense of, oh, it's good to be here. I can say anything. This is safe. I feel heard. I feel no judgment, and I can just bring up the things that have been frightening for me to even think about, let alone speak.
One of the things I recall from your book is that for many people, when they endeavor to move their seat of attention out of the head into the body, they find a kind of blockage in the neck. Like it gets, I think one of your clients said, it feels as if my attention is bouncing back up when I reach the neck.
Yeah. There can be both blocks in the head and blocks in the neck, and those are typically the ones that cause the most trouble for this kind of a process. And that's, those obstacles are really, see, the internal space. When we feel the internal space, there is some information from the literal body. So, for example, if you eat something that didn't agree with you, you might have a pain or a discomfort right where your stomach is, because you're actually feeling those signals from your physiological body. But a lot of what we feel in internal space also is a reflection of our mind. And so in the same way, so for example, in Chinese medicine, grief is associated with the lungs. Well, it's the internal space is a projected space, right? So because you can feel stuff in the middle of your head, you know that you're not actually feeling literally the middle of your head because there aren't any sensory nerves there. So it's a constructed space. And so in that constructed space, we actually have projections of what our term for it is dissociated ego states. That is, kind of subpersonalities, aspects of ourselves that decided to help us out, to make sure that something that was uncomfortable that happened never happens again. And they kind of dissociate a little bit from the central self, and they're kind of like, we're now going to enforce this policy. We're going to make sure that doesn't happen again. And when something resonant happens, that part of the mind gets activated and kind of runs its own little agenda trying to protect us. And so, it's often necessary to do just a little bit of negotiation with those parts to get them to realize, this person is now grown up. They're not, 8 years old anymore. So that part lets go of that responsibility and just goes, okay, yeah, I can be part of the team again.
As I recall, you write that young children are naturally locating their seat of attention in their body, not in their head. It's only as we grow older that it moves up into the cranium. Right.
So you might be acquainted with Michael Washburn's work, The Ego and the Dynamic Ground. Oh. He's got a really nice book describing the way that we start out and we're really kind of connected with life, right? We feel everything around us. We feel what's going on with our parents, with our friends. And so we're really in a very interconnected kind of space. And for that reason, we don't really have a strong sense of ourselves as separate. But that as we, get through latency and into puberty, that we get into what he calls the mental ego. And that's really a way in which the body contracts and the attentional resources are pushed up to the head. And, that's really helpful for getting through school, for example. And so, but the thing is, that's not the end of the process. Then there's the opportunity to reconnect after we've developed a good, strong mental ego, which is necessary, which is important, which is valuable, to reconnect with the rest of our resources and working with attentional stance to bring oneself down. I mean, this is something that meditation does. This is just this is a way to understand the mechanism. And that's something that's important for its, adoption in, wider adoption in psychology.
Well, can we give our viewers a little taste of some of the exercises that you offer for this work?
Sure. So one of the exercises is you take one finger and you touch very lightly on the top of the center of your head. So it's kind of like in line with the front of the ear, right up, and touching very lightly, and then taking the finger away. And then when you take the finger away, notice that there's still a little sensation on the top of the head. It's just like that little sensation is perched up there. And you just kind of keep your awareness on that sensation. Some people it's helpful to imagine it as a point of light. Some people it's better to just have it as a sensation. And then imagine that little sensation just begins to slide down through the skull and right down into the center of the head. So it ends up in the middle of the head behind your eyes. And then imagining that you can just become that little point of sensation in the middle of the head. Instead of being the whole head that's going, oh, look, there's a sensation in the middle, you become the sensation that feels the head all the way around it. And as you do that, you may notice that it feels like your mind comes into a little more focus. The other thing that you may notice is that it gets a little quieter in here. Because when the attention is spread out in the whole head, that's when we have all the thoughts, the narratives. Where did I put my keys? Got to remember to pick up the milk. What am I doing? Uh-oh, I'm late for this. Just that constant pattern. And when we are able to just come into the center of the head, things get quiet. So we don't even have to leave the head in order to have a quietly focused mind. I was teaching at a community college, and this was in a sort of lower socioeconomic neighborhood, and so you had some kids who were who came from the better parts of town, some who came from the lower socioeconomic brackets of parts of town. And so you had a mix of culture happening there. And I gave my first lecture, and I said, well, read these pages and come back, on Thursday ready for a quiz. And there was a kid who was slouched way down in his desk, and he just kind of yelled out in the room. He said, well, how are we supposed to do that? And I realized he wasn't trying to be disruptive. He was actually asking, how do you read and retain information to be able to, give it back to you on a quiz? Because obviously he didn't, he hadn't mastered that. Probably his parents never went to college. And so I said, well, listen, why don't you come with me after class and, I'll show you. And so we went up to this office where I was just kind of sharing a little space. And I opened it. I showed him, because he was very much in his body. He didn't know how to bring himself into the head and focus his mind. So I showed him how to bring himself. This is kind of the opposite of what I teach most people, right? Because he'd probably been told 100 times to pay attention, but nobody ever told him how. So I showed him how to bring his attention back to the core of his body and bring it up into the center of his head and sit quietly like this. I opened the psychology textbook. I said, here, read that paragraph to yourself. He read the paragraph. And when he got done, all he said was, oh. So I sent him on his way. I didn't even know if he'd come back for the next class. Came back, did fine on the quiz, got a B+ in the class. And it's like, I thought to myself, wow, this is so important. We tell students to pay attention, but we don't teach them how. And we don't teach them how because we don't know how. But if we can develop this, if we can, do the research, show that this is actually the way that you focus your attention. Wow, we could really use this as a culture.
It actually sounds so fundamental.
Right. We don't have, and here's the thing, part of the reason we don't have it is because the way that you regulate it is through the body felt sensations. In psychology, we're not very interested in body sensations. There's kind of a hierarchy. We're very interested in vision, we're very interested in words, but we're not very interested in body sensations. That's kind of like the Dalit class, the low class of senses. And yet, here is one of these key capacities that is actually regulated, that can be regulated through those body sensations. Mm-hmm. So it's like, to me, that's a great example of why we need a whole person approach, an approach that actually focuses on the entirety of our capacities and not just the ones that are particularly valued in Western culture.
As I recall, you build to some degree on the work of Eugene Gendlin in Illinois, who talked about the felt sense.
Yes, that's right. He was very interested in how self-location might extend beyond, that the sense of self might extend beyond the boundaries of the body. So we had a couple of conversations about that. But he called the felt sense the body's sense of itself and its surroundings, and really looked at it, because we think of the felt sense as just internally located, just giving us information interoceptively. But he really looked at it as gathering information both about what's happening in the internal environment, but also relational information, which I think is fascinating. And again, an area that has so much potential and yet so little research. I mean, it reminds me, you probably remember the movie Contact with Jodie Foster, and how, when they first got this signal, they had this signal that was going through the prime numbers between, 1 and 100. It's like, oh, they were so excited about that. And then there was this noise over on the side. Yeah, we don't know what that is. And eventually they find out that this thing that they thought was noise was actually much more complex information. And in a way, there's, we think about vision. Oh, that's great. Speech, that's great. And we ignore the felt sense. Oh yeah, that's just noise. That's just subjective. And yet I feel like there is so much potential. And this is an example of the kind of potential that there is in the bodily felt sense. A lot of sophisticated information as we learn how to, and as we just pay attention enough to it, as we give it credence, as we do research that can bring that out.
One of the points you make in your book is that there are neurotransmitters located throughout the body and synapses, particularly in the abdomen. There are a lot of nerves. It's almost like another brain down there.
Well, of course, Michael Gershon wrote that book, The Second Brain, exactly about that. And Candace Pert, of course, did groundbreaking work. Because, it's like when I was a kid getting my science classes, we called them brain chemicals. And of course, she did the first work that showed that what we call brain chemicals are, there's production and receptors for those in the major nerve plexi down the spine, and in, some of the major organs. So basically, these are circulating through the lymph, through the circulatory system. So we have this extended system that really goes through the whole body.
Another point I don't want to lose is that in the research that you did with your colleagues, you discovered that when the seat of awareness is located in different locations in the body, there are different EEG correlates.
That's right. We were able to show that, for one thing, that each attentional stance had a unique signature in at least one waveband. And more importantly, to me, this was one of the most important things. That is, when one of our participants would go into a particular attentional stance, then we would have them do other stances, and then we would have them come back to that same stance. The correlation between the first time and second time in the beta and gamma wave bands was between 0.5 and 0.98. So you can imagine, it's very hard to get correlation if somebody does a behavioral thing twice, or if somebody does an ordinary cognitive task twice. You're probably not going to see any correlation between the brain activity the first time and the second time. And yet, here, by using something regulated by body felt sense, we were getting very high correlation. So every time a person came back to the same attentional stance, they were recreating very similar brain activity.
Well, this is fascinating to me because you probably know there was a famous wager that got settled a year or two ago between David Chalmers, the philosopher, and Christoph Koch, the neuroscientist, that the wager started 25 years ago when Christoph said, well, surely we will in 25 years know the neural correlates of consciousness. And then 25 years later, he had to admit he lost the bet that we still haven't found the neural correlates of consciousness. But your research suggests that, at least with regard to these attentional stances, there are very clear neural correlates.
Yes, and as I recall, there was a case of fine wine involved in that wager.
Yeah. That's right. Christoph, whom I just interviewed, as a matter of fact, his interview will probably be released about a week before we release this one, had to buy a case of fine wine and give it to David Chalmers. I can only imagine that they were not aware of your research, or they, for whatever reason, decided it didn't count.
They probably hadn't gotten to it. But, it's like we're really just at the preliminary stage of this research. There's still a long ways to go to really nail down all of the different pieces of it. But I think we have a very promising start. And, my colleagues were actually, Doctors Lukova and Tyler were actually the first people to discover the brain processes associated with mental focus at all. So what they found in a paper they published in, I think it was 2012, was that we used to think that there's a spotlight in the brain, and that spotlight is created by some part of the brain that's holding that activation, gets more activated. Yeah. And what they found was the exact opposite, that the spotlight is created. If you imagine a theater, it's like the notion that we had was you're in the theater and then the attention turns on and creates a spotlight. Well, in fact, what they found was the house lights go down and the spotlight stays on. So the rest of the brain activity goes down, and that's what creates that attentional focus. And so in this work, we're kind of building on something they did before, at least on the neural side, and demonstrating exactly how you take that and you put it into experience and you put it into the hands of people so they can actually go, here, I know how to bring my mind to focus now.
Well, and if I can refer back to a moment with my conversation with Christoph Koch, the idea of the spotlight, I think, is associated with Bernard Bahr's work with what he called global workspace theory.
Right. Yes, global workspace. And to me, what we're doing is really kind of adding a dimension to the global workspace. And that is the body felt sensation is part of that global workspace.
That's all very, very interesting. Before we close, though, I want to bring up another interview. In fact, it'll be the interview we release right before yours, and it was with the chairman of the board of the California Institute of Human Science, Rick Jelicic, who focuses on the chakras in his work. And it seems to me here you have these 7 major chakras oriented from the top of the head to the base of the spine. And he talks about how people have 1 or 2 of the chakras dominant. It would seem to me that there might be some relationship between your work in terms of relocating the seat of awareness and the chakra system. I can't imagine but that you've given that some thought.
Yes. Well, one of the questions is what kind of a thing are the chakras? Yeah. And if we are, it's of course interesting that the major nerve plexi along the spine are in exactly the same place as the chakras, which of course probably just coincidence, right? Yeah. But the experience of the chakras is in this constructed space that is, my guess is probably, a relational construction between the neural structures that are here in the body and the ones that are in the brain. So that it is really more of a product of the whole person. It's located in this internal space. So these different places in that, what really is kind of, if you will, locations in the mind, right, that are projected onto the space of the body, that have different access to different resources. It's very consistent with this notion of attentional stance and self-location. That as you move self-location through these different spaces relative to the body, that it changes how your access is, how these different resources are available to you.
Another point I think worth emphasizing is that the work that you do enables people to accomplish tasks in some cases that they didn't even think were possible. You write about a woman with attention deficit disorder who seemed to be unable to retain anything she read and unable to write, but eventually received her doctoral degree.
That's correct, because she was able to read things once instead of reading it 3 or 4 times and retain it. And so she had an immediate impact. Just had her in an advising session at the university, and it I didn't speak to her for about 18 months, and she just said it was so much different. It was she had been diagnosed with ADD early in life, and this gave her a way to overcome that.
That's one of many examples that you have, but you've also pointed out that people can learn some of these techniques in half an hour and get the same results that might take other people years in Vipassana meditation practice.
This will help the teaching of meditation generally, because I had a conversation with someone who, he said, "Oh, I've been meditating for 30 years." I thought, "Wow, that's wonderful. That's remarkable. That's commendable." And he said, "But it sure is hard to get you to quiet your mind, isn't it?" And I stopped. I said, "Well, no, not really." And I showed him in 5 minutes how to get there rapidly. And here was somebody who had been putting in the hard work for many, many years and still had not kind of come across the specific way to quiet his mind. So, it's like I think that as we adapt these things for our culture, I mean, look, it was 200 years ago, you wanted to learn mindfulness. You didn't go to a class on Tuesday night. You left your home, you left your fields, your family, your business, and you moved to a village where that's all they did. And so you didn't need to have an efficient way to learn it because that's all you were doing. That was your whole life. But, that's a little impractical when you have a home and a mortgage and rent and kids and, utility bills. You just can't do that. We've got to have more efficient ways of learning these things because we need them. It isn't just people who can spend a lot of time, 3 hours a day meditating. It's the single mom with 3 kids who needs the stress reduction, who needs, it's the dad with 2 jobs. It's the kid who's, going to high school or college and working a job on the side, who needs to learn how to manage their attention, manage their stress, increase their ability to connect with themselves and others. And so we need to develop these more efficient ways to learn the things. I mean, I think that mindfulness-based stress reduction is a wonderful process, and I wish everybody could take it. And not everybody can. And so we need things that can work for folks who don't have the resources to spend on a longer training process.
Typically, I think a person might study Vipassana or mindfulness meditation, you mentioned, for an 8-week course.
Mm-hmm. Right. And some people study it for months and years. Yeah. And I think that's wonderful. I think, anyone who can do that should do that. And there needs to be something for all of us.
Back to the opening of our interview, you said that with regard to positive psychology, transpersonal psychology, and integral psychology, we have techniques that work, that are useful. We just need to do the research so that these methods can be more well-known and integrated into the larger society.
That's right, because we have cultural biases, not in the methods of science. Science is neutral, but communities of scientists are not. And when there are many, scientists who come from the same culture, it's very likely that some cultural assumptions about reality will creep in, just as a natural thing. It's not anybody's fault. It's just natural. And by sort of identifying what some of those biases are, challenging them, not because they are part of science, because they're actually not scientific to have cultural biases, so that we do better science. We'll do a better job of addressing the whole person.
Well, Glenn Hartelius, this has been a very enlightening conversation, and I commend you for the work you're doing. I hope that your new program at the California Institute for Human Science attracts many students and that we have many more opportunities to discuss these things.
Yeah. Would you mind if I just share the book?
Of course.
Yeah. So the book is The Anatomy of Presence, which is kind of a different take on it. We think of presence as just kind of an intangible quality. Really, here, along with attention, we're looking at how does presence sit in the body? What exactly is the way that we can develop it in the body and use it in ways that help us in our everyday lives?
And let me add that the book is full of actual practical exercises that the reader can use right then and there.
These are practices we've developed over 20 years and done, rigorous scientific research on.
Well, Glenn, thank you so much for being with me today and with the New Thinking Aloud audience.
Jeff, thank you so much.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy.